Today in 7th Circle Gaming, we explore the lands of Faerû in Baldur's Gate 3. And after a bit of full disclosure, we have a couple of screenshots to look at. And speaking of full disclosure, you're perfectly welcome to pause the video and read through all these, or let's move on to those screenshots that we talked about earlier. In our first screenshot, we'd like to share with you what the world looks like. And what we're seeing here is the game world after the prologue, so that we avoid any potential story spoilers. The user interface is not terribly unusual. We have the minimap in its usual place at the top right-hand corner of the screen. We have the action bar at the bottom center of the screen, although it is a very complex action bar with different options for displaying specific items over others or giving preference to certain things. The party management is at the lower left-hand corner of the screen, possibly to give as much space to the play space as possible. The game world is not terribly unrelatable. It's standard high fantasy with elves, dwarves, and other fantasy creatures. However, gravity does seem to work as it would in the real world. Moving on then to our second screenshot. What we're looking at here is the character creations screen, and this is one of the very major portions of the game. Player ownership of their character is something the game relies very heavily, or seems to rely very heavily on, to keep the player playing through the game. As such, there are several options for defining the player character's name, their species or race, their appearance, their class, their skills and or abilities. One interesting thing to note is that in appearance, the player can choose a lore-friendly or a lore-unfriendly option. That lore is based on the Forgotten Realms series of books. However, the class is not necessarily defined by the lore. Now then, without getting too far into the weeds here, let's move on to our next screenshot, which illustrates one of the other major portions of the game, although it does feed into the idea of player ownership of their character, and this is a story cutscene. Now, a story cutscene may end in a random number generation dice roll, the outcome of which we're seeing on the screen now. Players are able to influence the outcome of one of these dice rolls through their skills, abilities, or proficiencies. Players are also given the option of artificially stopping the dice roll by pressing the space bar, something that the game could do better to inform the player that they have the option of. Now then, we do need to talk about one of the other aspects of the game, which is the turn-based combat. This is not too unusual to other games in the turn-based combat genre. We have our percentage chance to hit displayed, and we have the initiative order displayed at the top of the screen, as well as the hit points of the currently targeting opposition or enemy creature. Now, the initiative order, or the order of operations, is displayed at the top of the screen, and what influences that is not necessarily fully described to the player, although players that have more familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons may be able to decipher that. That aside, though, we do need to move on and discuss the inventory management. To a degree, this is governed by the ownership of the player character and what class that the player chooses for their character. However, it remains to be said that each object in the game is going to have statistics attached for players to examine and attempt to optimize. And with that, let's move on to our first chapter proper. Here, Baldur's Gate 3 has earned a 12 out of 15 for immersion. The game will be attempting to utilize, in a large way, player agency. Players create a custom character, and the choices made by the player through the character are going to shape the in-game world. They are able to manage the upgrade paths for their player character as well as their party member. Players will also create a second character, although since that would potentially introduce spoilers, we won't mention more about that. As we saw earlier, the game is going to be utilizing presentation to get players invested into the in-game world. We're looking at a high fantasy world inhabited by elves, dwarves, other magical creatures, and the inclusion of magical spells. The game will attempt to utilize story to get players invested into the world, in the sense that the game does have preset characters for players to interact with that reveal part of a larger plot to the game. As complicated as that might sound. One of the other major aspects of the game, there's about 3 or 4 of them all told, is challenge. This takes the form mostly of turn-based combat, although some players may choose to include the outcome of those random numbered dice rolls in the challenge. However, because that is sort of defined by the statistics attached to the player character, we've put that in player agency. Finally, the game will attempt to utilize statistics focus to get players invested into the in-game world. This is of course taking the form of objects and characters in the in-game world having statistics attached for players to attempt to optimize and or manage. Now this is going to play again into the idea of ownership of the player character and their party members, trying to keep them alive. So it does play doubly into the idea of statistics focus and player agency. Finally, the game will attempt to utilize audio to get players invested into the world. This is going to be in the form of the lines of dialogue, some of which are voiced, some are not. There are combat sounds in the game. At present, it is somewhat limited. Of course, this being an early access game, we do expect that to increase as the game nears final release. One final side note here is that the player's options for creating a character that exactly resembles them are somewhat limited. So then, let's move on and discuss difficulty. Here, Baldur's Gate 3 has earned a 7.5 out of 15. The game has a complex user interface with several different key commands and options which it doesn't necessarily make fully clear to the player. There are several options for impacting difficulty, a total of about 6, however we did experience the game on normal difficulty. There is a distinct possibility that there are hidden statistics that players who may be more familiar with Dungeons and Dragons will be more able to optimize or influence. However, players that are not overly familiar with the source material won't understand what they necessarily are. Not all of the mechanics or options are explained to the player. And we'll touch a bit more on that later, so let's just put that aside for now. We did uncover some minor glitches which made the game more difficult than it otherwise would be suggested by the difficulty level. Now, this took the form of, in one of our evaluation sessions, a player which could only move around the map and could not make any sort of attack, either physical or magical. We also uncovered opposition or enemy characters that were able to attack through walls, close doors, and over rocks, which we were assured by the game would protect our characters, our party members rather, from any sort of harm. Now then, let's move on and discuss the lasting appeal, what it is that will be keeping the players playing through the game and keep the game installed on hard drives. Here, Baldur's Gate 3 has earned a 9 out of 15. It is an early access game, and everything that we've just seen is subject to change. It's also actively under development with regular patches. At present, of course being an early access game, there is no mod support through any site that the game may be purchased through, which doesn't require modification of the in-game files. There is also no downloadable content available, again through any site which the game can be purchased through. It is entirely possible to retry the game with different species, classes, difficulty levels, or amount of role-playing and/or lore friendliness. It is, we believe, too large to be experienced with one single character, mostly because there is the possibility of significant numbers of alternate choices and outcomes. Certain loot, we also discovered, seems to be randomized. Certainly on a character or two, we uncovered high-level gear in a random loot drop that other characters never saw. Attempting to experience every interaction with one character may increase the appeal, especially if the player attempts to spend several hours with the game experiencing everything that the game has to offer. Now then, let's move on and compile everything into the overall score before the video gets any longer. Overall, Baldur's Gate 3 in its present state has earned a 9.5 out of 15. The game has a very complex user interface, and we did uncover some glitches which made the game more difficult than otherwise would have been. It is a story-based game, however there is significant replay value. There is no option to skip the prologue, which may diminish the returns of the player as they play through the game with their second, third, fourth, or progressively more characters. There are, however, several options for creative problem solving, and initiative points can be gained from doing that. Now then, onto a couple of highly subjective statements before we finish the video, so please have those grains of salt ready. We do suggest highly that the player create a drow or a Githyanki character at some point, because it certainly seemed that these two species had the majority of the unique options, with some preference given to the drow. Some familiarity with this setting, that being Forgotten Realms or Dungeons and Dragons in general, may increase the appeal of the game. It is overly tempting to award the game a 15 out of 15 and consider it a perfect game, however that is not necessarily so. The character creation options are somewhat limited at present. As we said earlier, the ability of a player to create a character which exactly resembles them is limited. Additionally, the game seems to rely very heavily on player ownership of their character and the belief that the player inhabits this world. How much the player continues to have that immersion may fall off very quickly, defined by their experience with Dungeons and Dragons or their level of investment in the character. And with that, we will just say congratulations, this is the end of the video, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one from 7th Circle Gaming. Goodbye.